Hello, and welcome to Silent Echo. The boat was found drifting just off the shoreline. The engine was still running, not fast, not out of control, just idling, as if someone had stepped away for a moment. There was no damage, no sign of impact, no indication that anything had gone wrong. Inside the boat, everything was still there. A phone resting near the seat, a jacket folded where it had been placed earlier, a pair of sunglasses on the dashboard. Nothing scattered, nothing broken, nothing that suggested panic or struggle. The water was calm, no strong current, no sudden weather change, no reason for instability, and yet the person who had been in that boat was gone, not far from shore, not in deep, open water, just gone. Search teams arrived quickly. They marked the position. They scanned the surface. Divers were deployed within hours. The assumption was simple. If someone falls into water like this, the outcome is predictable. The fall, body should be nearby, either below the surface or drifting within a known radius. The area was contained, the visibility was manageable. The timeline was short. Everything pointed to a fast recovery, but nothing was found. Not that day, not the next, not in the weeks that followed. The boat remained the only confirmed point, a fixed location where someone had been. And then was not. Cases like this are often explained in simple terms. A fall, a slip, an accident, something sudden that leaves little time to react. Water closes over the surface, and whatever happened is hidden below. But even in those cases, something usually returns. A body resurfaces, an object drifts away from the point of entry. Time reveals what the moment hides. That is how these events are supposed to unfold. But in some cases, that process never completes. The surface remains undisturbed. Searches produce nothing, and the person is never seen again, not recovered, not located downstream, not found along the shore. Just missing. There are other cases that begin even closer to certainty. A person walks to the edge of a lake. They are seen. They are heard. They are only seconds away from others. They step out of view for a moment, and when attention returns, they are gone. No splash, no cry for help, no movement in the water. Just stillness. Their belongings remain on the shore, shoes placed near the edge, a bag left open, a phone still active, as if whatever happened interrupted the moment before it could fully happen. Search teams respond immediately. The area is small, contained, easy to define. Divers search the exact point where the person was last seen. The bottom is scanned, the perimeter is checked. Nothing, no trace below the surface, no movement away from the shoreline, no sign that the person entered the water in a way that could be followed. Only a location, and then absence. Rivers create a different expectation movement. Flow, a system that carries objects away from the point of entry. If someone falls into a river, the assumption is not that they stay in one place, it is that they move downstream along predictable paths, shaped by current, speed, and terrain. Search teams map those paths, they calculate distance, they track where a body or object should surface over time, and in most cases they are right. Something appears somewhere. But there are cases where even that system fails. A person disappears near a riverbank. Witnesses confirm their position. The entry point is known. The current is measured. Search teams expand downstream. They cover the expected distance. They extend beyond it. Nothing, no body, no clothing, no objects carried by the water, as if the current never took hold, as if the person never entered that system that should have carried them away across lakes, rivers, and coastal waters. These cases repeat, different locations, different conditions, different people, but the same result. A moment near water, a clear last known position, and then a complete lack of recovery. No return to the surface, no trace below it, no movement through it, just an absence where something should have followed at first. These incidents are treated as isolated accidents. Unfortunate, but explainable. Water is unpredictable. Water hides things, water changes outcomes. But when the same structure appears again and again, under conditions that should produce results, the explanation begins to weaken, because in each of these cases, the starting point is clear. The response is fast, The search is thorough. And still the outcome does not change. Nothing is found. No body, no trail through the bore. Water, no evidence that continues beyond the last moment, only a fixed point, a place where someone was seen, and then was not. And that is where the question begins. Not what happened in the water, but why in some cases the water does not give anything back at all. Water is often described as calm, still, quiet. But that description only applies to the surface. What exists beneath it follows a different set of rules. Lakes appear stable, flat open spaces without movement, nothing to suggest instability, nothing to suggest danger, but that stillness is deceptive. Because depth changes everything, light fades quickly. Temperature drops without warning, visibility disappears within a few meters. What looks clear from above becomes opaque below a person. Entering that space is immediately removed from sight, not gradually, but completely. There is no transition phase, one moment visible, the next not, and once. That boundary is hope. Across the environment behaves differently. Sound is muted. Movement is slowed, orientation becomes unstable. Up and down lose clarity. Distance becomes difficult to judge, even in controlled conditions. Water limits perception. In natural environments, that limitation increases. Sediment shifts, particles suspend in the water, light scatters, and diffuses. What exists below the surface is not just hidden. It is disconnected from what is visible above. Rivers create a different kind of environment. Less stable, more dynamic, constant movement, shaping everything within it. The current defines direction. Speed varies depending on terrain. Narrow sections accelerate flow, wider sections slow it down. Obstacles redirect movement. Branches, rocks, uneven ground. Everything influences how water carries objects, and once something enters that system, it is no longer controlled by its original position. It becomes part of the current. But even here, the system is not random. Water follows physical laws. Flow patterns can be measured. Movement can be predicted. Search teams rely on this. They calculate how far something should travel, where it should slow down, where it should surface, where it might become trapped, because even in moving water, there is structure. Cold is another factor that changes behavior. Water removes heat from the body faster than air. Even at moderate temperatures, the effect is immediate. Muscle function slows, breathing changes, control is reduced. A person in water loses stability faster than expected, and that loss of control often determines outcome within minutes. Depth, pressure, temperature, and visibility all combine to create an environment that does not behave like land. On land, movement leaves evidence, disturbed ground, broken vegetation visible. Direction in water, that process is limited. The surface resets quickly. Disturbance disappears. Ripples fade. Anything that happens is absorbed back into stillness, which means the environment does not preserve events in the same way. It does not record movement. It does not hold trace, at least not on the surface. But below the surface, there is still structure. Objects settle, bodies sink, weight and density determine position over time. Gases build and buoyancy changes, bodies rise. This is a known process, measured, expected, used in recovery operations. Which means that even though water hides things temporarily, it does not remove them completely. Given enough time, the system usually returns what entered it. This is what search teams rely on. Not visibility, not immediate detection, but process. Water does not erase it, delays it, alters. It redistributes, but it still follows. Patterns that can be tracked. Lakes hold, rivers carry both, operate under predictable conditions. Even when those conditions are complex, even when recovery is difficult, there is still a model that explains how something moves within water and how it eventually returns to the surface or to a location where it can be found. This is why water-related disappearances are often approached with a level of confidence, because unlike wilderness terrain where movement can be unpredictable, water has constraints, boundaries defined by depth, shoreline, current, and temperature. Everything that enters that system is expected to interact with those boundaries. to leave some form of recoverable evidence to appear somewhere within a defined range. But the cases we are looking at do not follow that expectation. They begin in environments that are fully understood, mapped, measured, studied, and still produce outcomes that do not align with how water is supposed to behave. Because in these cases the environment does not just hide, it withholds, not temporarily, but completely. And that is where the difference begins, not in what water is, but in what it sometimes fails to return. In most water-related incidents, the outcome follows a known sequence, not always immediate, not always simple, but predictable enough that search and recovery teams rely on it when a person enters water. Unexpectedly, the first phase is the point of entry. This is usually the most important reference, where they were last seen, where witnesses place them, where the event begins. From that point, the environment takes over. If the water is shallow, the outcome is often immediate. If it is deep, the body sinks. Weight, clothing, and temperature determine how quickly that happens. In lakes, the process is relatively stable. There is little to no current, which means movement is limited. A body will sink near the entry point or within a short radius. Over time, gases form during decomposition. Buoyancy changes, the body rises back to the surface. This can take hours, days, sometimes longer, depending on conditions, but it happens often enough that it is considered part of the feat. Standard recovery model. In rivers, the process is different, but still structured. The current becomes the primary factor. Once a body enters moving water, it is carried downstream. Speed depends on flow rate, terrain, and obstacles. But, again, this movement is not random. Search teams calculate drift. They map likely paths. They identify areas where objects slow down or become trapped bends in the river-submerged debris. Shallow sections. Places where the current changes, these become key search zones, and in most cases something is found, not always immediately, not always intact, but enough to confirm movement through the system. That is the expectation, not certainty, but continuity, even when recovery takes time. The process leaves evidence, objects separate from the body, shoes, clothing, personal items. These are often found along the expected path. They provide direction. They confirm interaction with the water. They extend the timeline beyond the moment of entry. Search operations are built around this logic. Divers focus on the entry point and nearby depth zones. Sonar scans map the bottom, looking for shapes that do not belong. Surface teams monitor drift patterns expanding outward over time. If the initial search does not locate the body, the process continues, because water does not remain static. It changes over time. Temperature shifts, pressure builds movement, redistributes objects, and eventually something appears. This is not theory. It is based on repeated observation across thousands of cases, even in difficult conditions, even in deep water, even in strong currents. The system produces results. There may be delays, there may be complications, but there is usually progression. A point of entry leads to a path. A path leads to recovery. That is how these cases are supposed to unfold. And when they do not, there is usually a reason that can be identified: severe weather, flood conditions, unusual terrain features, factors that disrupt the normal process. But even then, disruption leaves its own evidence, signs that explain why the expected outcome changed. In the cases we are examining, that explanation layer is missing, because the process does not just slow down, it does not become more difficult, it stops. The expected sequence never completes. There is a last known point, there is an entry assumption, but there is no continuation, no confirmed sinking, no confirmed drift, no resurfacing, no secondary objects appearing along a path, nothing that extends the event beyond the moment it begins. This is what separates these cases from standard water incidents, not the fact that someone entered the water, but the fact that everything that should follow does not happen. The system that normally returns something returns nothing. And when that happens, the investigation loses its foundation. Because without continuation, there is no direction. Without direction, there is no search model, only a fixed point and an outcome that does not match the rules the environment is supposed to follow up to this point. Everything follows a known logic. A person enters the water. The environment takes over time, passes, and eventually something is found. That is the baseline. That is what search teams expect. But the cases that form this pattern do not follow that sequence. They break it completely. Not partially, not with delay, but with absence. Nothing returns. No body, no movement. No objects that extend the timeline, only the last known point. And then nothing that follows. In many of these cases, the initial conditions are ideal for recovery. Calm, water clear entry point. Short response time. Search teams arrive early. Divers are deployed while the location is still precise. The bottom is scanned, the surrounding area is covered. And still there is no result. This alone is unusual, but it becomes more difficult to ignore when it repeats, because the same outcome appears under different conditions. In lakes where there is no current, in rivers, where movement should carry objects away, in coastal areas where tides create predictable patterns, different environments. Same absence. What makes this pattern distinct is not just the missing body, it is the missing process, because even when recovery fails, there is usually progression, something that confirms interaction with the water. A partial discovery. An object found downstream. A sign that the system is working, even if the outcome is delayed. Here that progression does not exist. The system does not produce intermediate results. It does not extend the event beyond the initial moment. It stops at the point where it should begin. There are cases where people are seen entering the water. Witnesses confirm the exact location. The distance is minimal. The time gap is seconds. Search begins immediately, and yet nothing is found. No disturbance below the surface. No body in the area. No movement away from the entry point, as if the water never received what was seen entering it. There are cases where individuals disappear near water without being seen entering it. Standing at the edge, walking along the shore, fishing from a fixed position, their belongings remain placed in a way that suggests they intended to return. Shoes near the bank. A bag left open, equipment still in use, but the person is gone, and the water shows no sign of interaction. No splash reported. No ripples observed, no indication that anything disturbed the surface at all. This creates a contradiction, because if the person did not enter the water, there should be evidence of movement away from it. Footprints, disturbed ground, direction of travel. But that evidence is often missing as well, which leaves only one assumption, that the event is connected to the water without the water showing any sign of involvement. Then there are cases involving boats, one of the clearest indicators that something does not align with expectation. A vessel is found floating, drifting slowly or stationary near the shore. Everything inside remains personal belongings, fishing gear, navigation equipment, sometimes even the engine is still running. There is no sign of struggle, no damage, no indication that the person left in a controlled way, and yet the boat is empty. In normal conditions, this scenario would lead to a defined search. A person falls overboard, the body should be near the vessel or along a predictable drift path. Search teams establish a radius. They track movement based on current and wind, and within that model, something should be found. But in these cases, the model does not hold, the boat remains, the person does not, and nothing connects the two beyond the initial assumption. Across all of these examples, the same structural break appears the moment where water should begin to produce results. It does not. No confirmation below the surface. No movement through the system. No delayed recovery, only a static starting point and an absence that does not change over time. This is what separates these incidents from typical water-related accidents, not unpredictability, but the removal of progression. Because once the process is broken, the search has nothing to follow, no direction, no model, no extension of the event beyond the last known moment. Only a question: why in some cases does water behave as expected, and in others produce nothing at all. Lakes are considered one of the most controlled water environments in search operations, not because they are simple, but because they are stable. There is no current moving objects over long distances, no downstream drift that complicates recovery. What enters the water tends to remain within a defined area. Depth becomes the main variable, along with temperature and underwater terrain. But even with those factors, the system is predictable. A person enters the water. They sink. They remain near the entry point, and over time the process leads to resurfacing. That is the expectation, that is what search teams rely on. Because in still water, the margin of uncertainty is smaller. There are no external forces removing evidence from the area. Everything that happens stays within reach. This is why lake recoveries are often successful, not always immediate, but consistent over time, which is what makes certain cases difficult to explain, because they begin under ideal conditions: clear shoreline, defined entry point, calm surface, no weather disruption. Witnesses place the person at a specific location. The distance to the water is minimal. Sometimes only a few steps, in some cases the moment is observed directly. A person wading into shallow water. A swimmer moving a short distance from shore. A fisherman standing at the edge, adjusting equipment. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. And then something changes, not in a visible way, but in outcome. The person does not return. Search teams arrive quickly. The entry point is known, the search area is contained, divers are deployed directly at the location. The bottom is scanned, expanding outward in measured patterns. Visibility is limited, but the zone is controlled. There is no current to move the body away, no reason for it to travel beyond the defined radius. And yet nothing is found, not during the initial search, not in follow-up sweeps, not in the days that follow, which contradicts the most basic expectation. Because even if a body is not immediately located, time should change. That buoyancy develops, position shifts, the body rises. This process has been documented repeatedly across different climates, different depths, different water conditions. It is not exact, but it is reliable enough to be built into recovery models. In these cases, that process does not occur, or at least it does not produce a visible result. Weeks pass, months in some cases. The surface remains undisturbed. Nothing returns, no body, no clothing, no objects that suggest prolonged presence underwater. This creates a specific kind of absence, because in lakes the system is closed. What enters should remain. What remains should eventually be found. There are cases where personal belongings are discovered near the shoreline, placed in a way that suggests intentional presence. Shoes left side by side, a towel spread out, a bag containing items that were clearly meant to be used. These details indicate that the person was not passing through. They had stopped, they were present at the edge of the water, and then they were gone without evidence of leaving the area on land, without evidence of entering the water in a way that can be confirmed. Search teams treat these scenarios with urgency because the defined environment increases the likelihood of recovery. The smaller the search area, the higher the probability of locating the subject. That is the assumption, and in most cases it holds. But in these specific incidents, the assumption fails, even when the lake is mapped, even when sonar is used, even when divers cover the bottom systematically. There is no result. The environment does not produce what should be there, and that failure is not isolated. It appears in multiple cases across different lakes, different regions, different conditions. The Pisa-Dedan pattern remains the same. Calm water, clear entry point, contained search area, and no recovery, no confirmation below the surface. No delayed resurfacing, no secondary evidence. Only the initial moment and the absence that follows it. This is what makes lake disappearances within this pattern difficult to resolve, because the environment itself removes most of the variables. There is no current to carry evidence. No large-scale movement to account for loss. The system should be simple, and yet the outcome is not, which forces the question in a more direct form. If nothing leaves the lake, then where does it go? Rivers introduce movement into the system. Unlike lakes, They do not hold. They carry everything that enters a river, becomes part of a directional flow. Water moves with force, with speed, that changes depending on terrain. Narrow sections accelerate, wider sections slow down, obstacles redirect the current, branches, rocks, uneven ground shape the path of movement. This creates a system that is not still, but predictable. Search teams rely on that predictability, because even though a river moves, it does not move randomly. It follows patterns that can be measured. A person entering a river is expected to be carried downstream. The distance depends on current speed, time in the water points of resistance along the path. Bodies can become trapped, temporarily held against submerged debris, caught in bends where the current weakens, but eventually something is found, either the body itself or objects that separated along the way, clothing, shoes, equipment. These items create a trail, not always continuous, but enough to reconstruct movement. This is the baseline for river recoveries, not immediate certainty, but directional continuity. A known entry point leads to a downstream search. That search expands over time, and within that expansion results usually appear. But in the cases that form this pattern, the system does not behave that way. A person disappears near a riverbank, sometimes seen moments before, sometimes within sight of others. The entry point is clear. The distance to the water is minimal. There is no confusion about where the event occurred. Search teams respond quickly. They begin at the point of last known position. They deploy downstream. They calculate drift. They identify likely accumulation zones. And then the process stops, not because the river is too complex, not because the conditions are extreme, but because nothing appears within the expected path. No body surfaces, no clothing is found along the banks. No objects are recovered in areas where the current slows. The river carries nothing, which contradicts its most basic function, because rivers do not hold. They move, they transport, they redistribute. Even small objects are affected by this movement. Floating debris, organic material, anything entering the system interacts with the current and leaves a trace of that interaction. But in these cases, there is no such trace. The entry point remains the only confirmed location. Everything beyond it becomes undefined. There are cases where search teams extend far beyond the matter. Calculated range, days past distance, increases. Multiple sections of the river are covered. Divers check submerged areas. Surface teams monitor drift zones. Still nothing. No confirmation that the person moved through the system at all, as if the river did not receive them in a way that could be followed. This creates a different kind of contradiction compared to lakes. In lakes, the question is why nothing resurfaces. In rivers, the question is why nothing moves, because the defining feature of a river is motion, and when that motion produces no result, the system itself appears incomplete. There are also cases where personal belongings remain at the riverbank. Fishing gear set up, a bag placed on the ground, shoes near the edge. These details indicate presence. They confirm that the person was there, that they were interacting with the environment, and then at some point that interaction stopped without transition, without visible movement into or away from the water. Search teams often consider the possibility that the person never entered the river, that they moved away on land. But this introduces another problem. Because there is no corresponding evidence of departure, no tracks leading away, no disturbance in the surrounding terrain, which returns the focus to the water, even when the water shows no sign of involvement. Across different rivers, different regions, different flow conditions, the same pattern repeats. A clear last known position near water, an expected downstream path, and no confirmation of movement within that path. No objects, no recovery, no delayed results, only the starting point and the absence that follows it. This is what separates these cases from typical river incidents, not unpredictability, but the lack of interaction with a system that should always produce interaction. Because a river does not keep things in one place. It moves them. And when that movement leaves nothing behind, the question becomes more difficult to ignore if the current did not carry them. Then, what did of all the scenarios in water-related disappearances the most difficult to reconcile are the ones involving boats. Because a boat defines position, it creates a controlled space, a fixed reference point, and an environment. That is otherwise fluid. When someone is in a boat, their location is known, their distance from shore is known, their interaction with the water is limited and observable, which means that if something happens, the system should respond in a predictable way, a fall overboard, a loss of balance. An accident, in each case there should be a clear transition from being in the water, and from that point the same process applies. The body sinks or drifts. The location can be modeled, the search can be structured, but in these cases the transition itself is missing. The boat is found, the person is not, and nothing connects the two beyond the assumption that something must have happened between them. There are reports of vessels discovered drifting slowly, with no one inside engines still running, navigation systems, active personal belongings left exactly where they were last used, a phone placed on the seat, fishing equipment still set up, food and water untouched. Nothing indicates urgency, nothing indicates a struggle, nothing indicates that the person intended to leave the boat, and yet they are gone. In some cases the boat is not drifting far from where it should be. It remains within a small radius, near the shoreline, near the last known position, as if whatever happened occurred quickly. And, without displacement, search teams approach these cases with a defined model. The assumption is immediate. The person entered the water near the vessel. The search begins around that point. Divers are deployed. The surrounding area is scanned. Surface teams track possible drift. Based on wind and current, the radius expands over time. Everything follows standard procedure. But the result does not follow expectation. No body is found. Near the vessel, no objects are recovered along a drift path. No secondary evidence appears to confirm movement through the water. The boat remains as the only fixed element, a static object in a dynamic environment, holding everything except the person who was inside it. There are also cases where the boat is discovered, anchored, not drifting, not damaged, exactly where it was intended to be. This removes even more variables. No movement, no external force acting on the vessel. The position is stable, which means the event occurred within a confined and controlled space. And still there is no evidence of what happened, no sign of a fall, no disturbance inside the boat, no damage to the structure, no indication that something forced the person into the water, only absence. In some instances, these boats are found within sight of land, close enough that any major disturbance should have been noticed, close enough that sound should have carried a splash, a call for help, something that signals transition, but there are no reports, no witnesses describing a moment of crisis, only the discovery, after the fact, an empty vessel where someone should be. What makes these cases particularly strong within the overall pattern is the level of control they provide. Unlike open shoreline disappearances, where multiple variables exist, a boat limits the scenario yet, reduces the number of possible explanations. The person was inside, the environment was stable, the position was known, and yet the outcome is the same as in less controlled environments. No recovery, no continuation, no evidence that extends beyond the last known state. Search teams often revisit these cases multiple times, reconstructing possible sequences, replaying the moment, looking for any detail that might explain how someone could leave the boat without leaving a trace. But each reconstruction depends on an assumption that cannot be confirmed, that the person entered the water in a way that follows known patterns, and in these cases that assumption never produces results, because the water does not return anything. The drift does not reveal a path. The search does not recover a body. The system behaves as if the transition never completed, as if the person moved from presence to absence without passing through the expected stages in between, across different regions, different types of vessels, different conditions. The pattern remains the same. A boat is found, everything inside remains, except the person. And there is no evidence. That explains how they left or where they went. This is where the visual impact of these cases becomes difficult to ignore, because the scene itself is complete. Everything is in place, nothing is missing, except the one element that should be impossible to remove without trace. And that is what makes these cases central to the pattern. Not because they are more dramatic, but because they remove uncertainty. They show a controlled environment and still produce the same unanswered result, a fixed point, a complete setting, and a disappearance that leaves nothing behind to follow. In most water-related incidents, the search is where uncertainty begins to disappear, because even if the initial moment is unclear, the recovery process fills in the gaps, the environment responds, evidence appears. A direction forms. That is how the system is designed to work. Search teams do not rely on chance. They rely on method-defined procedures built on years of experience and repeated outcomes. The first phase begins at the last known point. This is where everything is anchored, where the subject was seen, where the event is believed to have occurred. In water-related cases, this point is often precise, a section of shoreline, a fixed position in a lake, the location of a vessel. From there, the search expands in controlled layers. Divers are deployed early before the location loses accuracy. Before time introduces additional variables, they move along the bottom systematically covering the area, following grid patterns, ensuring that no section is left unchecked. Visibility is often limited, but structure replaces sight. Every movement is measured, every area is accounted for. At the same time, sonar is used to scan below the fib surface, creating an image of the lakebed or river bottom, looking for shapes that do not belong, anything that breaks the natural pattern, anything that could indicate the presence of a body or object. This technology has changed recovery operations significantly, allowing large areas to be covered quickly with a level of detail that was not possible before. Surface teams work in parallel, monitoring drift patterns, tracking how wind and current would move objects away from the entry point, expanding outward over time, adjusting the search radius based on environmental conditions. In river cases, this expansion follows the current, mapping downstream zones, identifying areas where objects are likely to accumulate. In lakes, the focus remains centered. Because movement is limited, the search builds outward from a fixed position. Drones may be used to scan the surface, thermal imaging in some conditions, additional tools layered into the operation, each one designed to reduce uncertainty, each one built on the assumption that the system will eventually produce results, because even when recovery is delayed, the process is expected to generate something: a detection on sonar, a visual confirmation from divers, an object appearing within the search area. But in the cases that follow this pattern, the system does not respond. The initial phase produces nothing, no confirmation below the surface. No anomaly detected by sonar, no object recovered by divers. The search expands, more resources are added, more time is invested, and still nothing changes. What makes this failure significant is not the lack of immediate success. It is the lack of progression. Because even in difficult recoveries, there is usually a shift over time. New information, a partial discovery, something that moves the investigation forward. Here that shift does not occur. The search remains fixed around a point that produces no continuation. In some cases, the same area is searched multiple times. Different teams, different equipment, different conditions, rechecking the same zones to eliminate the possibility of error. Because missing something once is possible, missing it repeatedly under controlled conditions becomes unlikely, and yet even with repeated passes, the result remains the same. Nothing is found. In river searches, the expansion continues downstream, covering increasing distance, mapping every possible route the current could take. Divers checking key points. Surface teams monitoring banks and debris zones. But again, the expected outcome does not appear. No body, no clothing, no objects carried by the water. The system that should distribute evidence produces none. Even when time extends beyond the initial search window, days turning into weeks, conditions changing water levels shifting. Still nothing surfaces. This is where search operations begin to lose their foundation. Because without evidence, there is no direction. Without direction, the search becomes a series of possibilities rather than a structured process. Teams are forced to consider scenarios that fall outside standard models movement, that cannot be confirmed outcomes, that do not align with known behavior of water, but even those considerations do not produce results. Eventually, the search is reduced. Not because the case is resolved, but because there is nothing left to follow. The last known point remains the only confirmed data. Everything beyond it is undefined, and this is what makes these cases different from typical water recoveries. Not that the search failed, but that the system, designed to prevent failure, never engaged in the first place, because every tool, every method, every model depends on one assumption, that the environment will respond, that it will reveal something over time. In these cases, that response never comes. The water remains silent. The search produces no extension of the event, and the investigation ends where it began, at a single point, with nothing beyond it, to explain what happened next. When a pattern reaches this level of consistency, the investigation inevitably shifts toward explanation. But at this stage, explanations are no longer simple conclusions. They are attempts to contain something that does not behave in a standard way. And every theory must be tested against the same problem. It must explain not just what is missing, but why the absence is consistent across different environments, different people, and different conditions. The first, and most grounded, explanation is accidental drowning. This is the baseline model used in nearly all water-related disappearances. A person enters the water, they become overwhelmed, they sink, they are. Not immediately visible in many cases, this explains recovery delays. It explains why bodies are not found right away. It explains why searches sometimes require time and expansion. But it does not fully explain cases where recovery never happens at all. Because even in drowning scenarios, the system still produces results over time. Bodies resurface objects, drift environmental interaction, eventually reveals evidence. So while this model explains some incidents, it does not account for the complete absence observed in the pattern. The second explanation is environmental movement and loss of trace rivers carry objects away from the entry point. Lakes shift with underwater currents, and decomposition processes, wind and temperature, affect surface conditions. Over time, these factors can relocate evidence outside initial search zones. This is a strong model for delayed recovery, and it does account for cases where objects appear far from the original point, but it still depends on eventual detection. Because movement does not equal disappearance, it equals redistribution. Something should still be found somewhere along the system, and in these cases that secondary evidence is often missing entirely. The third explanation is wildlife interaction. Aquatic and terrestrial animals can alter recovery conditions. They can move, remains disrupt evidence. Scatter objects. This is a known factor in many environments, and it is always considered in search operations. But again, this process leaves traces, irregular distribution of objects, damage patterns, fragmentation of evidence in the cases being examined. Those indicators are inconsistent or absent, which limits the explanatory power of this model. The fourth explanation is criminal involvement. Human interference can remove a person from a location without following natural recovery patterns. This includes intentional concealment or transportation of a body away from the search area. In isolated cases, this can explain lack of recovery, but it introduces additional requirements, evidence of presence of another actor, witness inconsistencies, physical signs of disturbance beyond natural causes, vehicles or movement patterns that do not align with the original scenario. Across the broader pattern, these indicators are not consistently present, and the distribution of cases across remote and controlled environments makes a single coordinated explanation unlikely. The fifth category moves away from standard models into more speculative territory. Failures in detection systems. This includes sonar limitations, human error in search coverage, environmental interference with visibility or tracking. These factors do exist in real operations, and they can contribute to missed recoveries. But modern search methods reduce these risks significantly, especially when multiple systems are used in parallel. Sonar divers surface tracking and repeated coverage are designed specifically to eliminate single-point failure, which makes repeated complete failure across different cases statistically unlikely. Another speculative idea involves environmental concealment beyond normal parameters. Areas of water that behave unpredictably due to unknown geological or structural features, deep cavities, underwater currents that do not follow expected patterns, zones where standard detection methods fail to register objects correctly. While such anomalies can exist locally, there is no consistent evidence that they appear across all regions involved in these cases, which again limits this explanation. The final consideration is not a single theory but a structural limitation in understanding the possibility that current models are not designed to account for certain edge cases where multiple variables fail simultaneously, not because of a single cause, but because of overlapping conditions that reduce the effectiveness of standard interpretation. In this view, the issue is not that water behaves outside physical law, but that the combination of time depth, temperature movement, and search delay creates blind zones in reconstruction. However, even this explanation struggles with one key issue: consistency. Because blind zones, in theory, should be random. They should vary in size and location. They should not produce repeatable outcomes across unrelated environments, and yet that is exactly what appears in this pattern. Every explanation eventually reaches the same boundary. It can account for part of the behavior, but not the complete absence of expected results, not the lack of progression, not the failure of recovery across systems designed specifically to prevent that outcome, which leaves the investigation in an unusual position. All standard models remain valid in isolation, but none of them can fully describe what is happening when they are combined across all cases. And that gap between explanation and outcome is where the problem remains unresolved. At this point, the investigation no longer revolves around individual incidents. It revolves around the same question repeating across every case: what actually happens in the moment after the last confirmed sighting near water? Because everything before that point is clear. The person is seen, their position is known, the environment is documented, the conditions are recorded, and then something breaks, not gradually, not with warning, but at a specific transition point where the expected sequence stops producing. Results search teams can define everything up to that moment with precision: entry point, shoreline position, boat location, witness confirmation. But beyond that point, there is no continuation. No body recovered in lakes that should return what they contain. No downstream trace in rivers that should carry evidence forward. No objects that consistently explain movement after disappearance. Only absence. And that absence does not behave like normal uncertainty. It behaves like a cutoff, a hard boundary where known processes stop producing observable outcomes. This is what makes these cases different from typical water incidents. Not that people disappear, but that the environment does not complete the expected sequence afterward. In standard cases, even when recovery is delayed, the structure remains intact. A timeline can be reconstructed, a path can be inferred, a set of conditions can be matched to outcome. But here the timeline ends abruptly at the same point every time, and nothing extends beyond it. Investigators are left with a set of consistent observations that do not resolve into a single explanation. Lakes that do not return what they contain within expected timeframes, rivers that fail to show downstream progression of objects or remains, boats found intact, with no occupant and no trace of departure, search operations that follow correct procedure yet produce no result. Each layer on its own could be explained, each case individually might fall within acceptable variance, but together they form something more difficult to dismiss, a repeated structural failure in the transition between presence and absence. And the most difficult part is not the lack of answers. It is the stability of the pattern itself, because randomness does not repeat with this level of consistency across different environments, different agencies, different years, different conditions, and yet the outcome remains the same, a confirmed position, and then nothing that follows it, no recovery that completes the story, no secondary evidence that restores continuity, only a point in space where everything was still explainable and then suddenly was not. Which leaves one final question that no search model fully resolves if water is one of the most studied environments in search and recovery operations. Why does it still produce cases where the system stops responding entirely at the same stage of every investigation? Not before entry, not during search, but exactly at the moment where the environment should begin to give something back, and until that question is answered, these cases remain open, not because they are unsolved, but because the structure of the outcome does not fit the structure of the explanation. Thank you for watching Silent Echo. If you want more cases like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video.